Buenos dias todos. I'm Barbara Wilson, and it's my pleasure to present this talk on the past, present and future of neuropsychological rehabilitation. So, neuropsychological rehabilitation. Well, let's look at the past first. The earliest known description of the treatment of head injury is from an Egyptian document of 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. This was discovered by Edwin Smith in Luxor, Egypt, in 1862. It contains the first known descriptions of the cranial structures, the meninges, the external surface of the brain, the cerebral spinal fluid, and the intracranial pulsations. The word brain appears for the first time in any language. The procedures demonstrate an Egyptian level of knowledge of medicines that surpassed that of Hippocrates, who lived 1,000 years later. These are descriptions of the first 7 of 48 cases. I won't go through them all, but you can see they all relate to problems with traumatic brain injury. A wound in his head penetrating to the bone of his skull, number 1. Number 7, a gaping wound in his head penetrating to the bone and perforating the sutures of his skull. But this document's really about treatment rather than rehabilitation. So if we move forward many centuries to Paul Broca, a Frenchman from which we get Broca's aphasia, he describes treatment of an adult patient who was no longer able to read words aloud. So Broca taught him to read letters, then syllables, and then combine the syllables into words. The man failed to learn to read words of more than one syllable. So Broca then switched to a whole word approach. In fact, I tried this out with one of my patients with an acquired disorder of reading way back in 1979. But this patient, Broca's patient, learned to recognize a number of these whole words. Now, this is the first known photograph of brain injury rehabilitation, and it's also the first known photograph of occupational therapy. So if any occupational therapists are watching, this is just for you. This is actually an American photograph taken in 1917, but most of the work in World War I was actually done in Germany. This is the man, a German man, who was particularly influential in modern brain injury rehabilitation. So Kurt Goldstein was a German neurologist and psychiatrist who was a pioneer in modern neuropsychology. He treated soldiers acutely at the frontier. They were transferred to Frankfurt to a milieu therapeutic department. We have those today. And evaluations were performed by psychologists. A school and a workshop were available. Now, following World War I, Goldstein established the Institute for Research into the Consequences of Brain Injuries, and it was here that he developed his theory of brain-mind relationships. In 1930, he accepted a position at the University of Berlin, but then the Nazis came to power. Goldstein, a Jewish man, was arrested and imprisoned in a basement. After a week, he was released on the condition that he would agree to leave the country immediately and never return. For the next year, he lived in Amsterdam. He wrote his masterwork, The Organism. There we go. And then he emigrated to the USA in 1935, and he became a citizen of the United States in 1940. But apparently he was never very happy there and always missed his home country. Now, another person, a compatriot who lived the same time as Goldstein, was Walter Popperreuter, and he was also a German neurologist and psychiatrist. And from 1914 to 18, so in the First World War, he carried out investigations of brain-injured soldiers, and documented the results of loss and impairment of brain function. But he joined the Nazi Party in 1931, so he wasn't a good man, but the reason he's in here was because he published the first known book on brain injury rehabilitation. It was published in 1917 and was translated into English in 1981, I think. But in this book, he described his treatment of soldiers with visuospatial and visual perceptual disorders, so they'd all had damage to the back of the brain. And he also discussed vocational rehabilitation. And many of the strategies he described are similar to those in vocational rehabilitation programs today. Now, moving forward to the Second World War, sadly it's wars that lead to moves forward in rehabilitation, we come to Alexander Romanovich Luria, the famous Luria, who's often described as the grandfather of neuropsychology. Now, Luria was born in Kazan, then part of the Soviet Union, and he went to Kazan University at the age of 16. He obtained his degree in 1921 at the age of 19, so a very bright young man. And while still a student, he established the Kazan Psychoanalytic Association, and he planned on a career in psychoanalytic psychology. His earliest research sought to establish objective methods for assessing Freudian ideas about abnormalities of thought and the effects of fatigue on mental processes. But then came World War II, and Luria led a research team at an army hospital looking for ways to compensate psychological dysfunctions in patients with brain lesions. The tragic, widespread availability of people with various forms of traumatic brain injury provided him with voluminous materials for developing his theories of brain function and methods for the remediation of focal brain lesions. Now, this book I put up here by Luria and a patient is called The Man with the Shattered World, and it's a longitudinal study. It takes place over 25 years of a Russian soldier who had gunshot wounds through the parietal lobes, documented his recovery over a 25-year period. A really interesting book. And if you haven't had that book and get a chance to read it, I would recommend it. But at the same time as Luria, in the United Kingdom, was Oliver Zangwill. And he's sometimes here called the father of British neuropsychology. He worked in Bangor Hospital just outside Edinburgh, Brain Rehabilitation Unit, with British soldiers who'd survived brain injuries. And an important paper by Zangwill in 1947 on the rehabilitation of people with brain injury appeared in 1947, in which he discussed, among other things, the principles of re-education. He referred to three main approaches: compensation, substitution, and direct retraining. As far as we know, he was the first to categorize approaches to cognitive rehabilitation in this way. This is the paper, published in 1947, but of work carried out between 1941 and 1945, and that's still worth reading today, I feel. But Oliver was a great friend of Luria's, and this photograph was sent to Oliver by Luria sometime after World War II. It shows Luria catching a sturgeon, from which we get caviar, and Shirley Zangwill, Oliver's second wife and Oliver's widow, who's still alive, gave this photo to me in 1996. It's quite a special photo, I feel. But moving forward to yet another war, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, saw Yehuda Ben Yishai, who's there, he's still alive. He is an American Israeli. And after the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli Ministry of Defense got together with the New York University Institute of Rehabilitation Medicine, run by Leonard Diller and Yehuda Ben Yishai, and they asked Yehuda to go back to Israel to set up a service for brain-injured soldiers from the Yom Kippur War. And a day treatment program was established in 1975 in Tel Aviv in Israel. And this was the forerunner of the holistic programs. The Oliver Zangwill Centre in Ely, the one I founded in 1996, follows this holistic program. So it was founded by Yehuda, but he was very much influenced by Kurt Goldstein from World War I too. Now, another famous person at the time, Leonard Diller, who sadly died a year ago, he set up the first program to call itself Cognitive Rehabilitation in New York in 1976. Now, some of us, including me, had been doing cognitive rehabilitation before that, but we hadn't called it cognitive rehabilitation. So Diller's was the first one to call itself cognitive rehab. He was also one of the first people to publish studies on the treatment of patients with unilateral neglect. For example, improving scanning training and anchoring, and we still use some of those treatments when we're treating unilateral neglect to this day. Now, I've put this photograph in because it's a historically important one, although Geschwind, who's there, Norman Geschwind, wasn't known for his rehab work, but he was a very important man in neuropsychology. And this photograph was taken of the two of us at a meeting in Greece in 1984, meeting on reading disorders. And Geschwind died 2 months later, so this is one of the last photographs of him. So that's why I thought it was important to put it in this history talk. Now, another important person that many of you will have heard of is George Prigatano. And in 1986, he set up a rehabilitation centre in Oklahoma City, very much influenced by Ben Yeshai, who in turn was influenced by Goldstein. And Prigatano's unit later moved to Phoenix, Arizona. So the holistic approach, we can say it's been pioneered by Yehuda Ben Yeshai and George Prigatano. And one of the main characteristics of the holistic approach is that it's futile to separate the cognitive consequences of brain injury from the emotional, social, and functional consequences. Because how we feel affects how we think, how we remember, how we communicate, how we solve problems, and how we behave. These functions are interconnected, they're hard to separate, and all of them need to be dealt with in rehabilitation. So I actually did a sabbatical with George Prigatano in 1993, and I learned a lot of things there, but I didn't want to go and work in the States. I'm very much a European. So on my return to England, I met Tony Jewell from the National Health Service. And I was telling Tony Jewell about my wanting to set up a rehabilitation centre like the one in Phoenix, but I didn't want to go back to the USA. And I wanted to put into practice the best principles of rehabilitation. So partnership between patients, families and staff, setting meaningful goals, evaluating what we're doing, and so on. And Tony Jewell said to me, put in a business plan. And I thought that won't work, but I did it anyway. And a series of meetings followed. And so I had many meetings and plans. And 3 years later, I got agreement from the Health Authority, part of the National Health Service. I had a call from Richard Taylor, who was then Chief Executive Officer of the local trust, the NHS trust, telling me that we got the go-ahead. And in this 3-year journey, I'd attracted both allies, people who were very helpful, wanting me to succeed, but I also attracted enemies en route. Some people didn't want me to open the centre. They thought it had to be run by a medical person, and I didn't want that because they had to be boss, and I wanted it to be a more democratic process. Then I had to choose a name. I wanted to call it after somebody who'd influenced rehabilitation, somebody who was British, because it was a British rehab centre, somebody dead, so I didn't offend anyone, and someone with a pleasant-sounding name. So I chose Oliver Zangwill, and we called it the Oliver Zangwill Centre, founded in 1996. I thought, well, clinical psychologists can influence the National Health Service and the health care of patients. You don't have to be a medical person to do this. Of course, in the past, we're still on the past, I'm moving on to the present in a moment, there are many other influential people I could have mentioned. So Catherine Mattea has been very influential. Ian Robertson, colleague of mine, we worked together in Cambridge for several years before he moved to Dublin. Keith Cicerone, an American who's a great ally of brain injury rehabilitation. Jim Marlek developed the goal attainment scaling method. He's now retired but still alive. Jenny Ponsford from Australia, very influential in traumatic brain injury rehab. Robin Tate, great friend of mine, who's done wonderful work on single case experimental designs in Australia. Nick Alderman, who's a British guy working with brain injured people with very severe behaviour problems and severe brain injury. He was the first PhD student I supervised. Jonathan Evans, ex-student of mine, worked with Jonathan for 14 years. He's now a professor in Glasgow. So I could have mentioned all of these. They've been very influential in brain injury rehabilitation, plus others. So let's move on to the present. Well, what is neuropsychological rehabilitation? It's not the same as recovery, if by recovery we mean getting back to what one was like before the injury or illness. It's not the same as treatment. Treatment's something we do to people or give to people, like drugs or surgery. It is a two-way interactive process. So this is an old definition of rehab, but I particularly like this one. Lindsay McClellan in 1991 said, "Rehabilitation is a process whereby people who are disabled by injury or disease work together with professional staff, relatives and members of the wider community to achieve their optimum physical, psychological, social and vocational well-being." Now this is a neurologist and a professor of rehab talking about psychological well-being way back, so he was ahead of his time in some ways. And one of the reasons I like this definition is it shows that it's not the same as recovery, and it shows it's a process whereby we work together. So I've been very much influenced by McClellan's approach. Now, cognitive rehab, that's a process, this is my definition, but influenced by McClellan's, is a process whereby people with brain injury work together with professional staff and others to remediate or alleviate cognitive deficits arising from a neurological insult. A neuropsychological rehabilitation, it's similar to cognitive but broader. Now, some people use the two terms interchangeably, but strictly speaking, cognitive rehab is about the cognitive problems, and neuropsychological is concerned with the amelioration of cognitive, emotional, psychosocial and behavioural deficits caused by an insult to the brain. So that's my current understanding of what neuropsychological rehabilitation is about. And the main purposes of such rehab is to enable people with disabilities to achieve their optimum level of well-being, to reduce the impact of their problems on everyday life, and to help them return to their own most appropriate environments. And it's not to help people score better on tests, or learn lists of words, or be faster at detecting stimuli. We can do all those things in rehab, but that's not the purpose of it. That's not why we do it. People can do better on tests and still not cope in real life, or they can cope in real life and not do better on tests. So the two are quite separate. Or we could say that the purpose of rehabilitation is to enable patients to achieve their personal goals. One of my goals was to complete the London Marathon, and there I am, halfway through. I didn't look quite as good at the end of the marathon, but I did complete it. This was in 2008. Now, goals are negotiated between the patient, staff and family, plus anybody else that might be involved, like the teacher or dietitian or social worker. And rehabilitation should function on goals relevant to the patient's own everyday life, be implemented in the setting where the patient lives, or if you have to do it in a clinic or a hospital, you've got to ensure generalisation to the setting where the patient lives. They should be collaborative. It's not something we impose on the patient, something the patient and his or her family want to do. And what we're trying to do is reduce disability and improve real-life functioning. So we should target real-life problems as far as possible, address the real-life difficulties experienced by people with brain injuries, unless you're asking a particular question which cannot be answered in that way. So with our errorless learning work in memory rehab, for example, we started off asking an experimental question, and then we made sure the principles we discovered could be applied to real-life difficulties. So the results, if you are going to do it in a more experimental way, should be applicable to real-life problems. Now, Luria believed that psychological research should be for the benefit of humankind, and we should look at the person in his or her social context. Absolutely right. I believe in that absolutely. And this is what we try to do in our rehabilitation centre in the United Kingdom. So I think the main changes over the past 20 or so years have been that rehabilitation is now a partnership with patients and families. We use goal setting to plan and to some extent to evaluate rehabilitation. There's a recognition that cognition, emotion and behaviour are interlinked, and that's the core belief in the holistic approach. There's an increasing use of technology. Rehabilitation should start in intensive care, not too much because people are still recovering and need little short, sharp doses of rehab. And we need a broad theoretical base. No one model or theory or framework or approach is sufficient. So, rehabilitation is now a partnership between patients or clients, if you prefer that word, families and healthcare staff. It's focused on the achievement of personally meaningful and functionally relevant goals. The typical goal areas we have at the Oliver Zangwill Centre, we always have a goal on understanding brain injury. The patient has to understand what's happened to him or to her. There's often a goal to do with work. Now, we don't have a goal getting back to work. We don't know if that's possible. But typically it would be determine the areas you need or the skills you need in order to return to work. You need to be on time. You need to be able to use maybe a computer or whatever. There's often a leisure goal, swimming, badminton, attending a leisure club, whatever. There's often a goal to do with driving. There's nearly always a goal to do with using a memory system, compensating for your memory problems. There's frequently a goal to do with communication, maybe to do with mood issues such as anxiety or depression, a goal to do with activities of daily living. Now, some of these goals can be done by any member of the team so long as they're good. So understanding brain injury, the psychologist can do it, the occupational therapist can do it, the speech and language therapist can do it, the physiotherapist can do it. But with some of these, so communication, that's always done by a speech and language therapist in our centre, and the mood's always done by a psychologist. Activities of daily living, done by the occupational therapist. So some of these any member of the team can do, others you need specialist skills. So the holistic approach is important in current rehab because we do need to consider the cognitive, social and emotional aspects together. The main proponents have been Ben Yushay and Prigatano, but Annalisa Christensen sadly died last year in Copenhagen, was also influential. Now, all holistic programs do both group therapy and individual therapy. There's one of our mood groups run by Fergus Gracie there. And what we try to do in this holistic program is increase awareness of what's happened to the patient, promote acceptance and understanding. So, for example, I may not be able to remember or communicate as well as I used to, but I can still lead a meaningful life. There's frequently something to do with cognitive remediation, compensating for their memory, improving their problem-solving skills. So we develop compensatory skills, and there's always some aspect of vocational counselling, either getting back to work or finding an alternative to work. The increasing use of technology, well, we know the high-tech things like imaging procedures, but in a clinical setting, you often can't do that. You don't have the money, you don't have the time, you don't have the expertise to do it. We focus very much on compensations for cognitive difficulties. One of the ones that we've evaluated a great deal has been NeuroPage, developed by this young man's father. This is a young man living in California who had a traumatic brain injury. His father was a British engineer working in the States, and he got together with a neuropsychologist to develop a paging system to help his son return to college. And we've been evaluating that for a number of years now. And the pager used to be just a pager, but now people can choose between a pager or a mobile phone or a smartphone. We did a randomised control trial of that. We had people referred from all over the United Kingdom, and they were randomly allocated into Group A, who were going to get the pager first, or Group B, who were going to go on the waiting list first. Now, this is the baseline period, and there's no real difference between the two groups. They chose their own things, what they wanted to remember every day. And in the baseline, they had a checklist. Did they achieve these things, like taking medication, feeding the dog, and so on, taking your glasses, taking your homework? And we had a carer check as well, or a relative, because these are memory impaired people and they may not remember what they can't remember. So we're pretty sure this is accurate. Then Group A get the pager and go, or the mobile phone, and go right up. B on the waiting list don't change. Then A give the pagers back and they drop a little bit, but they're still better than baseline. B, meanwhile, get the pager and they go up. So this is fairly convincing evidence that it's the pager or the mobile phone that's improving their everyday achievement of their everyday targets that they want to achieve. So we showed that NeuroPage significantly reduces the everyday failures of memory and or planning in people with brain injury. We've shown in our centre that we can save the health and social services money. And the research influenced clinical practice because the Health Authority set up a clinical service for people throughout the United Kingdom, and that's still running to this day. There's lots and lots of other compensatory memory aids, location device here. If you lose things, you can attach one of these little devices to it, and you press one of these colours if you've lost something, and walk around the house, and as you get closer and closer, it beeps at you. Pillboxes we're probably all familiar with, talking watches, voice alarm reminders, and so forth. And this one I particularly like. This is a clock. Have I got it on there? No. This is a clock that tells you the days of the week. So for those people that are always saying, what day is it today? What day is it today? This clock will tell them if it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. This one does the days of the week and the time, but it's a bit more confusing, I think. It depends on the ability of the patient you need it for. But there's hundreds of these things that you need to investigate for your particular client, and not just for memory. You can get compensatory aids for visual problems, for communication problems, for planning problems, and so forth. We also know that rehabilitation should start in intensive care, and there's some of the work of the people we've done with disorders of consciousness, but I think that's a separate talk and I can't do much this time on that. Now, then we also need a broad theoretical base, or several bases if you like, because survivors of brain injury are likely to have several cognitive problems. So for example, with attention, memory, executive functions, word finding, this is typical of anybody getting referred for rehab. But they're also likely to have non-cognitive problems, so with anxiety, depression, social skills deficits, etc. Therefore, it's very unlikely that any one model or theory or framework can address all of these difficulties. And if you're constrained by one theoretical model or theory or approach or framework, that can lead, I would suggest, to poor clinical practice. So you need to refer to several models and theories. Models and theories of cognitive functioning, of course, of learning, of emotion, of assessment, many different ways to do an assessment, models and theories of recovery, of plasticity, the holistic models, and so on. Now, in 2002, I tried to draw all these relevant models together and I called it Towards a Comprehensive Model of Cognitive Rehabilitation. I should have called that Neuropsychological Rehabilitation, I feel. It was published in Neuropsychological Rehabilitation, the journal, in 2002. Now, I'm going to put it up, but don't try to digest all this. It's just to show you that rehabilitation is complex. You have to start with the patient and family. But there were people at the time, and who still say, you only need a good model of cognitive functioning and then you can do good rehabilitation. Well, that would be this bit. And I think that's not sufficient. What about all these other things you need? Personality, nature of the brain injury, the family views. How are you going to evaluate? Are you going to try to restore lost functioning, encourage anatomical reorganisation, or what? So rehabilitation is complex, and you don't just need a model of cognitive functioning to do good rehab. You need to take everything into account. So we're now going on to the last bit. What is new in neuropsychological rehabilitation? Well, there's a lot there, I could have said. But there's recent studies in brain-computer interaction. I think got a lot of mileage there. Computational modelling. Fatigue has recently become a big issue in rehabilitation. Awareness, virtual reality assessments and treatment, pharmacological studies, developments in CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy, including compassion-focused therapy, positive psychology, etc. Support in the early stages of dementia is another big area, as increasing recognition of the value and importance of psychosocial, non-pharmacological interventions to help maintain or support functioning in early stage dementia. And interest in this area has been encouraged by the recognition that the efficacy of currently available medications is very limited. Now, the first randomised control trial of an individual, goal-oriented cognitive rehabilitation aimed at supporting functioning in everyday activities has finished several years ago now, this by Linda Clare. This is Linda Clare. She was a PhD student of mine at one time. She's now a very eminent person. And I think she's probably the world expert in rehabilitation for people with dementia. So that particular paper was published in 2010. It was a single-blind, randomised controlled trial comparing cognitive rehab with relaxation therapy and no treatment. So 3 groups. She did it in an outpatient, community-based setting. She had 69 individuals with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or mixed Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, and a mini mental state examination score of 18 or above. So they were definitely impaired, but not very severely impaired. And the primary outcomes were goal performance and satisfaction. She also used questionnaires assessing mood, quality of life and carer strain, and a brief neuropsychological test battery. And a subset of participants underwent functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. So the cognitive rehab group produced significant improvement in ratings of goal performance and satisfaction, while the scores in the other 2 groups didn't change. The behavioural changes in the cognitive rehab group were supported by fMRI data for a subset of the participants, and the findings support the clinical efficacy of cognitive rehab in early stage dementia. So that offers a means of assisting people with early stage Alzheimer's disease and their families in managing the effects of the condition. There's been a number of theories and models influencing rehabilitation. Duncan's model of goal neglect. The patient's able to report what he or she intends to do and has been told to do, and yet this intention does not adequately control subsequent action. And that led to goal management training. Brian Levine's been influential in that, so is Ian Robertson. And in the goal management training, we use this all the time at the Oliver Zangwill Centre. Stop. What am I doing? Check the mental blackboard. Define the main task. List the steps. Learn the steps. Do it. Am I doing what I planned? Then I also hope in future rehab will draw on a wider range of theories and models This is the Y-shaped model developed at the Oliver Zangwill Centre, where we're trying to reduce this discrepancy between the old me before my stroke or brain injury, the me as I am now, into this new me. So you're reducing this discrepancy into the new me. There's also been the recognition of the need to evaluate rehab in more appropriate ways. We know it's a partnership now between patients, families and staff, and it involves many complex processes aimed at enabling people who are disabled by injury or disease to achieve their optimum level of physical, psychological, social and vocational well-being. And because of the great heterogeneity of patients receiving such rehab, and because of the variety of aims and methods required to achieve ultimate goals, the measurement of treatment effectiveness and final outcomes resulting from rehab are difficult to evaluate. So randomised trials in rehab, well, they are possible, but they're not easy and they need to be carefully thought out. You cannot do a double-blind randomised controlled trial where neither the person giving nor the person receiving treatment knows whether the real treatment or a placebo. The therapist or psychologist has to know what he or she is doing. You can do a single blind, and that is what Linda Clare's study was doing, for example, where one party is blind to whether the real or placebo treatment is being given. But the point I'm making here is randomised controlled trials are not the only way to evaluate rehabilitation. So as Keith Andrews said many years ago, the randomised controlled trial is a tool to be used, not a god to be worshipped. It's excellent where the design is simple, marked changes are expected, the factors involved are specific, and the number of additional variables likely to affect the outcome are few and can be balanced out. All of these, not what we see in rehabilitation. So if you're asking the question how many subjects improved, that's a question about groups. The results apply to groups, and you need a group design to answer the question. But if you're asking, is this particular patient improving? And if so, is the change because of what we're doing, or would it have happened anyway? That's a question about an individual, and you can't answer that with a group study. You can get ideas from the group study, but you can't answer that question. Is this particular patient we're seeing changing? And is that because of what we're doing or because of natural recovery or extra attention? You can use a single case experimental design, and I'm running out of time here, so they're perfectly respectable scientific methods, and neither group nor individual studies are better. It depends on the question you're asking. Large group studies need many people to share out individual differences, and small groups do not have to concern themselves with this, as each subject is his or her own control. And you use baselines instead of control groups. Now, I just wanted to mention this paper by Robert Tate and her colleagues. I was one of the colleagues. The Single Case Reporting Guidelines in Behavioural Interventions. Yes, there are the authors. It was published mainly in the Archives of Scientific Psychology, but 9 other journals at the same time. Robin Tate managed to get 10 journals altogether to publish this because it was such an important paper. We know that single case designs are commonly used, and what Robin and her colleagues did was present 26 items authors need to address when writing about single case experimental designs or by the reviewers. Each item's described, so you've got examples there. So good clinical practice then. Cognition should not be divorced from the other things. We should focus on real life problems. We need a dialogue with other disciplines, otherwise misunderstanding can occur. We need a broader theoretical base. This is one book published with 2 colleagues, edited with 2 colleagues, where 17 survivors write their stories. Each chapter is written partly by the survivor and partly by the psychologist, so you can read what the patients or survivors think about rehab. There's some of the books in the series. There are many other future directions I could have mentioned: music therapy, compassionate mind therapy, errorless learning studies, working memory treatment programs, but I couldn't cover everything. I am a bit sceptical about imaging and rehab. The imaging tells us lots of useful things. I'm not against imaging, but I don't think it's particularly helpful for rehabilitation. They don't answer the big questions. What does the family think is important? How should we teach the use of a compensatory aid? And all those things. Pharmacological treatments combined with neuropsychological rehab, yes, I think there's a future in that. But the greatest need is to persuade healthcare purchasers that rehabilitation makes clinical and economic sense, and there is plenty of evidence for this. So it makes sense. We can help people compensate, bypass, reduce their problems, and survive more efficiently in their own most appropriate environments. It's possible to combine theory, scientific methodology, and clinical relevance. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful conference.